Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Nutritional Revolution podcast. I have Kristin here with me. You want to say hi?
Hello.
We're going to dive into all things hydration. This is part 2. So if you guys missed part 1, that came out last week, depending on when you're listening to this, where we covered dehydration and fluid losses, what is defined as dehydration or being hydrated, some signs of dehydration, why is maintaining hydration important, what are things that can affect your hydration status, and how to track your sweat losses. And today we're going to be going into proper hydration techniques, what to look for in a hydration product, maybe some of the products we suggest, timing of use, why, and then we're going to cover some questions from our audience. And I think Kristin has some self-experience story to share with you as well. So yeah, this will be a fun one. So kind of first thing I think we'll dive into, which was one of our audience's questions, is how does hydration differ from pre an event or training versus during versus maybe recovering and rehydrating? And we'll start from the beginning. The pre-training or racing hydration is important. I mentioned this in the part 1, is that vast majority of athletes start their sessions dehydrated, most likely unknowingly. So it is important to do those, go into your session, of course, hydrated, because you're going to progressively continue to get dehydrated typically during your sessions. So kind of if we're thinking about less than 24 hours, maybe less than 5 hours before a race or an event or a hard training session, there's some suggestions that have been put out there in the literature, which lean towards a 5 to 10 milliliter per kilo consumed of fluids in the 2 hours pre-exercise. And for those of you who want an example in ounces, for a 150-pound athlete, we're looking at consuming 340 to 680 milliliters or 12 to 23 ounces in the 2 hours pre-exercise. Just from a fluid perspective, you can absolutely throw in some salts in there.
I usually have my clients do like 2 big cups of water. So usually, 12 ounces, 8 to 12 ounces, 2 big cups, one with electrolytes and one without. And
there you go.
That usually.
Yeah. I think that's smart too, because many of our athletes train in the morning. And as many of you know, typically during the night, you are not sipping fluids and, maintaining hydration. We do tend to wake up in a dehydrated state. So getting some fluids in you before you go out the door is going to be helpful in that performance.
I always have to remind my clients too of, how much performance you can lose by becoming dehydrated, because a lot of runners are scared to drink in the morning because they're worried about having to pee on their run.
Yeah.
I always tell them, would you rather just have to take a quick bathroom stop, or do you want to get dehydrated and lose performance, not recover well? And, then, you're not moving forward, you're moving back. So that simple bathroom stop, as annoying as it may be, is definitely worth it.
Yes. Yeah. I have athletes do with like Ironman events. They're long. And many athletes want to, get as fast a time as possible. And of course, using the restroom takes time. However, if you're out racing for 8, 12 hours, you should be peeing. Like you should be peeing, if not multiple times.
Yeah.
You should not be peeing over 12 hours. That would likely mean you're definitely in some state of dehydration. The other thing I'll mention when it comes to prehydrating is something called preloading or fluid overloading. And this is something where there's actually, I think maybe a couple products out there called preload, where they're just really high sodium content. And what that does is it helps, well, one, it makes you thirsty, so you drink more water, but it helps pull water into the cells to kind of similar to, I'm sure many of you have heard of like carb loading. When we carb load or glycogen supercompensate, we're trying to stock our system with as much carbohydrates so we can delay that loss on event day. Same thing goes with fluids. You can load up your body's fluid stores so you can delay that rate of fluid loss and dehydration on race day. the fluid overloading, there can definitely be some, negative consequences with that for sure. There's a fluid overloading technique where you can do just in the hours prior to an event. And in the research, they did see the reduced total fluid deficit incurred had been shown to increase total body water when they did this fluid loading. It helped expand plasma volume and did enhance their performance. But some downsides, of course, are gut discomfort, peeing regularly, as you mentioned. And then if you're downing just loads of plain water, you can actually increase your risk of hyponatremia. So you are diluting your sodium concentration in your blood in a way that could be detrimental and definitely sacrifice performance. So something you can do is actually just the week, there's research to support this as well, but the week leading up to an event, they had athletes actually double their fluid intake. I think they were consuming close to 2,000 milliliters a day. They had them consume almost 4,000 milliliters per day or 4 liters a day. And they were able to reset their normal fluid balance to retain an extra 600 milliliters of fluid. So yes, you're going to be peeing more. You're not all of a sudden going to store an extra 2 liters on your body. However, you will store what is that? 25% of that additional fluid that you're consuming. And when they did this, the athletes did have an improved heat tolerance, an enhanced duration of work in the heat, and a lower maximum heart rate in the time trials that they were subjecting them to. So I know a lot of people struggle in the heat. So this definitely starting hydrated or doing some preloading can be a good tool to help with that.
I usually recommend to my clients when they start carb loading to also start fluid loading as well, especially for those marathon runners that are worried about having to do a lot of pee stops. I tell them, well, then let's fluid load when we start carb loading earlier on in the week and really just almost double your normal water intake. And then we can taper down to race day. So you're not doing it the day before the race. You can drink, your normal fluids the day before the race. And in the morning of the race, you didn't, obviously you have to drink something, but not a ton because we've already built up those.
Yeah. There's actually a trick, and I tell my clients this too, so that study looked at loading for a whole week, 7 days. I think a lot of times people get close to a race, just maybe in the days before a race, and they're like, oh, well, I should start hydrating now. And maybe that's 2 days before the race, they start thinking about it. And actually a technique that is used by wrestlers to weight cut is actually to 2 days before load with extra fluids. And then the day before the event, if they don't continue to load with that same amount, say they consume half the amount, what ends up happening is the kidneys assume you're continuing to drink that amount of fluid. So it starts peeing out at that rate. So it's a water dehydration technique used by wrestlers to load extra 2 days before and then consume half as much essentially the one day before. And I have seen athletes get into trouble doing that, where they'll really start thinking about it and drinking. And then the next day they're probably not as thirsty and they're peeing like crazy. And they actually are setting themselves up for dehydration. Yeah. Not good. All right. So we covered pre-fluid requirements. So we'll dive into during, and I will say this is going to be very unique. If you want to touch on to the part 1, I talked about how to do sweat testing to understand your fluid losses. And that's where you're going to learn more about maybe what your unique fluid amounts should be to aim for to minimize fluid losses. So I'd go back to part 1 and listen to some of that. But I think the first thing we might want to cover is when should someone even bring some hydration?
What do you mean, bring it during?
When should someone plan to bring hydration during a training session or an event?
I mean, I always, and it also depends on the sport, but with runners, I say an hour or longer usually, but if it's hotter, you should carry if it's, anytime you go out. I would say if the temperature is above even 75 degrees, it doesn't hurt to have fluids They have wonderful handheld bottles that you can have. You could even store a bottle and, do a loop and come back to it, because, staying hydrated is always better than, even in that hour, you can become dehydrated if it's super hot.
Yeah.
As far as, cyclists, I say never, ever leave without a few water bottles, even a backup water bottle on your bike, because you never know what can happen on a bike.
Yeah.
You get a flat tire, you could be out there for longer. So if you're going out for an hour ride and you're like, well, I only need one bottle, which technically you probably could get away with drinking one bottle. However, on the bike, you never know. So I always say, always have 2 bottle cages, and unless you're on a mountain bike, and then have a hydration pack with you, like a fanny pack with some water in there, and fill both waters when you leave the house.
Yeah. I think doing the test too of the like weighing yourself pre and post for many people is a big eye opener when they don't bring a bottle. And what I've found with my athletes too is if they do say 60 minutes on the bike versus a 60-minute run, their fluid loss on the run is significantly greater than on the bike. So
but a lot of runners don't carry anything.
Exactly.
Cyclists always have water.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. And I've learned the hard way running, for sure. I hate carrying things when I run, and I'm like, oh, I'm only going out for an hour. But when it's hot or humid, you sweat a lot. And I always wish even at 15 minutes, I had that water bottle with me. So plan ahead.
Yeah, definitely. And I think too, the thing to mention, is once you're sweating, and if you're sweating for several hours, most people are not drinking enough fluid to definitely not even match what's being lost. I mean, as soon as you start going, I mean, you're furthering dehydration, even if you have fluids, right? So, just bringing, whether it's water, if it's like you're saying 60 minutes or, a little bit longer, if you want to bring just water, if you start going above 90 minutes, maybe you want to start considering some electrolytes. So we can cover what that might look like. Did you put a study in here, Kristin, right? The 2015 study.
Oh yeah. Yeah. They did I was reading about a study that they did on half Ironman athletes and triathletes. And they did a group that took, 12 salt tabs in 3 doses throughout the race. And then they also did a placebo group that just drank their normal, probably, noon or whatever. And the athletes that took the salt tabs had they finished 26 on average, finished 26 minutes faster than the placebo group, and were able to replenish 70% of their sodium loss. Whereas the placebo group, even taking some electrolytes in their bottles without taking the salt tabs, they were only able to replace, I think it was 20% of their electrolyte loss. Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
26 minutes is a big chunk of time too.
Huge. And it also looked at, it was really interesting study, and also looked at like their power files on the bike and stuff. And it just showed that, the athletes that took the salt tabs and replaced those electrolytes had more power throughout the bike session. And the perceived effort on the run, heart rate was lower. So it was interesting.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, we know too, when you can get enough salt in, it's going to further stimulate that drive to drink, which will help, right, in that situation. Many times when we exercise, it can decrease our drive to drink. And there's different schools of thought on whether do we follow a kind of a drink to thirst mechanism or protocol when we're racing, or should we have a timed protocol? I tend to lean towards a timed protocol.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. I mean, I think the higher intensity, I think I mentioned this in part 1 of the hydration recording podcast, where they looked at, and I'm sure many of you are probably listening and are going to say duh to this because you probably experienced it yourself, but there's a correlation with increased pace in runners and decreased drive to drink, which is as the intensity goes up and your pace is faster, your desire to drink is going to go down. But as you go at a faster pace, your muscles are working harder, you're creating more heat in the body, you're going to be sweating more. and you're going to be drinking less. And so you're just, again, going to be furthering that dehydration. So I think having a timed goal and setting up, whether it's a timer on your watch to remind you to drink, it's every 10 minutes and it's just a couple sips. I definitely encourage like more frequent small sips versus hitting the hour mark and trying to chug half your bottle.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
going to lead to GI
I mean,
issues.
I say 20 minutes is the minimum, I would say. Some with runners, because you're taking even smaller sips, I usually do every 10 to 15 minutes, take a sip, because they are smaller sips. You cannot chug water, especially if you're running at a decent pace.
Yeah.
So usually like every 10 minutes. I mean, it makes the time go by too. When you're doing a tempo run like that, it's like, oh, it's great. I get to take you're kind of focused on more like, okay, 10 minutes. Yay, I get to sip some water. But the more frequent, the better, because your gut, it'll be friendlier on your gut.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think too, kind of to touch a little bit back on like that drink to thirst or drive to drink, intensity will decrease that. But I think something also important to notice is that there have been studies suggesting that postmenopausal and even menstruating women in their high hormone phase, they see a decreased drive to drink. So setting up those reminders for yourself to drink regularly can be beneficial potentially in those individuals. So definitely something to consider. So I mentioned too, ways to fine tune your specific hydration requirements, because as you're probably learning, they are very inter-individual. So there's not just women need this amount and men need this amount. The fluid amount and the sodium concentrations are going to be all across the board. So definitely tune into part 1 if you guys want more information on that. But I think something we should cover too is there a possibility to consume too much fluids or electrolytes during?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I had done some sweat testing with a group of triathletes, actually in an indoor training bike trainer situation. And it was interesting because there was no fans on them. And I think this happens to a lot of people when they're inside, there's no fans on, you notice that sweat on your skin. You see it piling up, versus if you're outside, you don't notice it as much because the wind has that evaporative cooling. It's pulling the water off the skin. Is your sweat rate different if it was the exact same temperature? Likely not, but you notice it more in that indoor trainer situation. And when we were doing the sweat testing, I noticed when we did the weigh-ins pre and post, the athletes, when we weighed them post, a handful of them over-consumed fluids during the bike trainer situation because they felt like they were losing so much more sweat. In reality, they were not. And so something like that is helpful information to know. So, I mean, maybe they were in fact thirsty, or they were really pushing the fluids. And if so, their gut was probably well trained, but maybe not necessary in certain temperature conditions. So, I mean, maybe not necessary. So are you just, maybe carrying too much weight and then, in the form of water on your bike and in bottles when you're out and about too, if you're racing, you might not need that much potentially. Or you could think of it too as you're really prepping your hydration for the run if in a triathlon situation. But if your gut can't handle it, that's definitely another piece. And then potential hyponatremia. So if you're drinking just loads and loads of plain water, that's where we're starting to get into that place where we can still be losing sodium in our sweat. And now we're just drinking plain water, not replacing those electrolytes. And we can continue to dilute our blood sodium concentration. And that can be deadly. So you definitely want to keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
So we have now, we'll move on to post-training and kind of the recovery there and rehydrating. And there's a bit of like research and suggestions here. And again, there's a way trick you can use. But simplest thing would be is, can you weigh yourself pre and post? And for every pound of body weight lost, you want to aim to consume 24 to 32 ounces of additional fluids. You can add some sodium in there. Sodium, potassium, they say, can help further that rehydration, but other electrolytes like magnesium and stuff like that, research doesn't necessarily support including those to further the rehydration status any more so than the sodium potassium would, interestingly. So that can just be a little trick. And I think Kristin has a story to share with us that has to do with prehydrating, I think,
this
right?
is the prehydration, because we haven't really talked quite about the prehydrate products. But I went down to the Tour of Gila bike race. It's a stage race, and it was, I think the forecast was going to be in the 90s, and it's at elevation, coming from the Pacific Northwest. That's a huge jump in temperature. I'm not used to training at that. So my teammates and I were like, well, we heard about this scratch, preload product where we can just, make sure that we got all of our electrolytes taken care of and before. So I took, I think I took maybe more than the even recommended dose of the scratch the night before. And I woke up the next morning, race day, and I was so sick to my stomach. My fingers were all puffy. I mean, I felt horrible.
Shoot.
And another thing is like, I didn't really realize I'm not a super salty sweater. But I just thought, well, everyone else is doing this, so you really have to tailor it to you. I mean, that's why a lot of our athletes ask me, like, off the top of my head, how many electrolytes do I need? How much water do I need to drink during my workouts and in races? And I have no idea. Everybody is so different. That is one recommendation I do not give off the top of my head, because, even at a certain body weight, you could be, a very non-salty sweater. So unfortunately that first stage was almost, I just felt horrible. I had to just power through that first stage. So lesson learned to never try anything new before race day. So if you're going to use these products, which can be very helpful, especially if you are a high sodium sweater, if you see a lot of salt after your workouts on your body, they can be really useful, but practice. Never ever try anything new before race day.
I think we say that, and I know people have heard us say that, and sometimes people still get sucked in, whether it's like by the vendor booths or what, like it seems like a good idea.
I'm going to try this product at the vendor booth. And like, for me, this was pre-master's degree in nutrition, but all my teammates were doing it. So why shouldn't I?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's something to kind of talking about that. I mean, with our athletes, we're, sweat testing, we're sweat sodium concentration testing, we're gut training, and we're practicing race simulations well in advance of race day. So we'll run through all that lead up stuff, so we get exposure to practice and see what works, what doesn't work. So if you ever need help with that, you guys can always work with us one-on-one to get some fine tuning for sure. So I think kind of on that note, some things we'll want to dive into is like, what things should you look for in a hydration product? And I'm going to bring up one of the questions that we got from our audience, and that was, what is an ideal carb solution for hydration drinks during exercise? And she gave the example, should it be 4 to 8%, or should it be 1.5 to 4%? And I think she brings up a really great question. And there are a lot of companies out there that will talk about, our products isotonic or hypertonic or hypotonic, or, and so they're trying to target these concentrations that are most similar to the blood, or potentially, how do I say this? Slightly, is it less than the blood? So then it gets pulled into the bloodstream. So they basically want a quick crossover of the intestinal barrier, whereas you don't want it too concentrated to the point where there's the possibility that when you swallow that solution, for example, that it gets into the intestine, it's so concentrated that it actually needs to be diluted before it can be pulled across the intestinal barrier. And that could be done by your body pushing actually fluid out of the blood into the intestine to dilute this thing. Some people that will occur, and they can actually get diarrhea if you think about we're pushing water into the intestine and colon. can lead to diarrhea if the things that are being consumed are too concentrated. So I would say kind of there's a certain circumstances situation, I think, to answer this question. I think if you are doing a training session or a race that's short and you're only using a bottle with hydration in it and you're not consuming any fuel, I would say you do want to choose an electrolyte product that has some sugars in it for sure. And it could be, in that 4 to 8 range. I think 4 to 8%, maybe 6% is a sweet spot, is okay. You're going to get a little bit of carbs and calories from that, but because you're not consuming any food that would provide other forms of sugars, you do need to get some sugars in your electrolyte product to essentially bind to those. There's a receptor in the small intestine that's called a sodium glucose transporter. So it needs a sodium and it needs a glucose to bind to the transporter to open the doors of the transporter essentially and allow water to be pulled across. So you shouldn't really be consuming, I should say, something that has no sugars in it if that is the only thing you're consuming during that session. However, there's always a caveat. If you are fueling with stuff, again, that has sugars in it, so maybe you're drinking or using gels or chewing on some chews, like if you have a product that actually has no sugars in it, but you're eating those things alongside of it, all of that stuff is mixing in the stomach. So you should be okay. Yeah. But of course, always gut train, right? Yeah. I think that's important. So let's see. I lost my place here. Yeah. Okay, there we are. What to look for in a hydration product. So first things first, prehydrating, hyperhydrating. There's, as Kristin mentioned, there's products out there for that. There's preloading products, Scratch, Osmo, Precision Hydration has it's called pH 1500, yeah. So 1500 milligrams. So those can all be used in a similar way for prehydrating. Again, always practice. You can do something like that the night before a race and potentially even the morning of a race, depending on the individual, the length, the heat, exposure, all of that stuff. And then in terms of products for during, as I mentioned, choosing products that potentially have some glucose in them. Our kind of suggestions, and I'll ring these off of highest sodium content to lowest sodium content. So these will be products that contain glucose in them that you should be fine consuming as is, no additional fuel if it's a short situation. For example, this could be the Precision Hydration 1500 sachets. Could also be the Precision Hydration 1000 sachets, so not tablets. This could be Liquid IV, has 500 milligrams. Scratch Active Hydration has 380 milligrams. Noon Podium series, so the powdered version of Noon, not the tablets, that's 380 milligrams of sodium. And then we have Osmo Active Hydration that has 260 milligrams of sodium. If you are wanting a very simple, maybe not so sweet hydration product, and you are going to be consuming fuel, so gels, chews, etc., you could go for a low glucose option hydration product. And that could be any of the Precision Hydration line version of tablets. It could be Element, the LMNT product that has 1000 milligrams of sodium, or Noon tablets that are very low in sugar, and that has 300 milligrams of sodium. So different variety, and there's a time and a place for these things. And again, always practice.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times for it's kind of sports specific, whether, you should have some glucose in there. If you're doing like a short mountain bike race, and you're just getting your nutrition through hydration through the bottle, since it may be hard to eat, I usually suggest, one of the glucose containing, electrolytes that we talked about. But a lot of times for runners who are taking in gels and chews, it's easier to calculate how many carbs per hour you're actually getting by taking in the food for the fuel and then drinking, a lower glucose electrolyte drink, just because, you could potentially cause gut distress by over consuming too many carbs. If you like realize, oh my gosh, I'm so thirsty, and you start chugging, an electrolyte drink that's high in carbohydrates as well as taking your nutrition. But normally when you run, you're just sipping. And so it's hard to really count the exact amount of carbohydrates you're getting per hour from drinking. And so I'd like to use food for fuel for that, just so we can be a little bit more precise on how many carbs per hour you're getting.
Do you find, talking about how our runners do not like carrying stuff, do you find the majority of your runners prefer to use on-course hydration?
I usually not. I mean, a lot of times, it depends on what it is. Most of my runners ahead of time know what it's going to be, but I always in marathons have my runners, or half marathons, have my runners carry whatever electrolyte solution they want with them. And then at every aid station, drink water. So you don't have to worry about carrying an electrolyte and water, because that can be a lot. But if they've trained with a specific electrolyte and then the race doesn't have that, I always have them put that in their handheld bottle. Sometimes if they're going to be out there for a long time, if it's a 5-hour marathon, bring the mix and then refill your bottle with that. And at the water stations, if they don't have your exact hydration product, because, it's selective of what these races have, and you may not be used to it. It may not be something that you like or your gut can tolerate.
Yeah, I think that's smart. I've found it seems like for sure many of my triathletes will bring their own hydration for their bike.
Yeah.
But once they get to the run, they want to rely on course, which tends to be Gatorade endurance. And so that you don't have a choice. That has to have sugars in it. Of course, you could get water. But what I've found with some of my athletes is it's hard to stay in control of the sodium concentration. So once we start sweat sodium testing and we know how much fluid they're losing, but also how much sodium they're losing on the run, even the Gatorade endurance, it's pretty concentrated in terms of sugars. The sodium loss for some of my athletes, and then talking about whatever fueling they're using, they're not hitting their sodium target. So talking about those salt tabs or salt sticks and stuff like that, those come in handy big time if athletes can use them. The thing being there is test and train, test and train, because I've seen also too many situations where the salt sticks are the thing to do and people are using them and then they do not need them. Their sodium losses are not potentially that high. And so I think and then they end up they have GI issues. And then I've had other athletes where complete opposite, they were actually having GI issues when they were not consuming enough salt. So when we looked at their fueling products over the course of the run, they were getting barely any sodium. So they were not pulling in the fluid and pulling it into the cells, right? That fluid was basically loading up. It was too dilute and loading up and causing this individual to have diarrhea. So once we added salt to her run, she was able to pull that fluid across the intestinal barrier instead of having it hang out there. So again, test, practice. If you need that customized, that's something we can help you guys do. Another question we got from our audience, which I think is a great one, and actually something that Chris and I were just talking about before this podcast, that my opinion of has evolved over the years, is in regards to utilizing slushies and things like that during racing. The question specifically is cool or cold versus warm water, better for multi-hour session events. And so this is really interesting. I was actually surprised myself when I was doing some more research of this, because I was of the thought of kind of a different approach. For a while, I'll tell you what I had learned and what my school of thought was, which was, yes, slushies, slurries, use those if you can keep the water as cold as you can for consumption during exercise to help cool you. What I've found out over the years as research has evolved, very interestingly enough, these slushies and slurries can be great for pre-cooling and post-cooling. But what they actually found when athletes were using them during was that the coolness, although it does off heat in the gut. So when you do actually the combination of like a slushy, think of like a Slurpee style, little crushed ice cubes versus very cold water, you can off heat better with the Slurpee style slushy, right? As opposed to cold water. However, that cold effect caused the thermoreceptors on the skin that stimulate sweat to stop sweating. So you almost negated your effects of cooling yourself, which I thought was fascinating and makes sense and is super interesting, right? So it's possible that consuming these slurries during a state of exertion maybe is not the best option. However, you can still pour water on yourself in these areas where we get that evaporative cooling effect. So the hands, the neck, the forearms, technically the feet is a good one, but hopefully you don't want to get blisters, right? So things like that might be better tools to cool yourself, so we're not turning off the body's sensation to continue sweating, which is our main way to cool us. So very interesting, interesting area. Any thoughts on that or to add?
No, that study is fascinating. I had no idea. So now we know that slushies are great before and after.
Yes.
But I think, and what I found in super hot races and even training is, just getting water on your skin is the best way. So even, some bike races, like I would carry an extra water bottle in my back pocket of my jersey with just water, and that would be what I use to squirt on me when I started to feel like I was getting overheated, and it helps a ton.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the way to go there, even in humid environments too, where the offing of heat is kind of harder, but you can still get some cool water on you. And then the one final question we had from our audience was, does black coffee really dehydrate you? If so, that sucks. And I think that was a myth for I'm calling it a myth because it's a myth. It was popular talk for a while. What the research actually defined was that over a certain amount of milligrams of caffeine, then they start to see a diuretic or a dehydrating effect. And if I recall correctly, I want to say it was equivalent to 400 or 500 milligrams of caffeine, which is equivalent to 4 to 5 cups of coffee. So if you are in that camp, then yes, in fact, maybe you are dehydrating yourself. But actually the beverage that will dehydrate you the most is actually alcohol. So not a question by our audience, but that one will absolutely dehydrate you and impact your performance, unfortunately.
I mean, the main thing I tell my clients is do not drink coffee as your hydration in the morning. Don't treat it as what you're using to prehydrate.
Yeah.
But if you have a cup of coffee, by all means, it's not going to dehydrate you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely no sodium in your coffee, or I mean, at least not a lot. Right. Awesome. Well, I think that is it for today. So we covered proper hydration techniques, what to look for in a hydration product, maybe when you should use a glucose containing hydration product versus a low sugar product, and the products we suggest. And then of course, questions from our audience. So thank you, Kristin, for helping me break all this stuff down for everybody today, and enjoy, you guys. Happy hydrating.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.